Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Indiaspora's second annual Climate Summit. We are so excited that you could join us today. We have an incredible lineup of presenters. But before we get started, a quick reminder, please enter any questions that you have for our speakers in the chat, and time permitting, we'll do our best to address them. Now, to kick off our program, we have a special welcome message from Indiaspora's Executive Director, Sanjeev Joshipura, who is traveling and could not be here with us today.
Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Sanjeev Joshipura. I'm Indiaspora's Executive Director, and welcome to Indiaspora's second annual Climate Change Summit, the future of our planet, perspectives from public, private, and civic change makers. Let me introduce Indiaspora to you. I'm sure many of you know who we are and what we do, but I'm sure there's several of you that don't. Indiaspora is a nonprofit organization founded in 2012 by the noted entrepreneur, investor, and community builder M.R. Ramaswamy in San Francisco. Our mission is to inspire and position the global Indian diaspora as a force for good, and to be a bridge between diaspora leaders and India. There are three verticals or pillars that we work on. One of them is philanthropy and social impact. Another is nonpartisan political and civic engagement. And the last one is innovation and entrepreneurship. And then there are what we call our two horizontals that cut across the work in all of our verticals. One of which is Diaspora Next, which is about engaging the next generation of the Indian diaspora. And the second one is our Global Connect program, wherein we expand our work globally, not just in the United States where we were founded, but also to other countries where there are plenty of Indian diaspora, such as the UK, Canada, Australia, Singapore, the UAE. In fact, we have also just opened our India office very recently. As you don't need me to tell you, climate change is a supremely important issue, one of the defining issues of our time. And we are investing in making this event a continued event. This is our second summit, and we are looking forward to making it annual. It cuts across several aspects of Indiaspora's work, which makes it very meaningful for us. But perhaps more importantly, there are so many Indian leaders and Indian diaspora leaders in positions of influence that work on this issue from many different angles, as is evidenced by a fantastic speaker lineup and panelist lineup that you will hear from very shortly today. So I would say sit back and enjoy, but I won't. What I will say instead is participate, and let's get our sleeves rolled up and enjoy the event. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Shobha Vishwanathan, Senior Manager of Development and Civic Engagement at Indiaspora. While Sanjeev had to join us pre-recorded because of travel constraints, our opening keynote speaker today joins us live from Rajasthan, India. It is an honor to introduce Sunita Narain, the Director General of the Center for Science and Environment and editor of the bi-weekly magazine Down to Earth. She is involved with policy formulation and issues of environment and development in India and globally, and has worked extensively on climate change with a keen interest in advocating for an ambitious and equitable global agreement. Sunita Narain was a member of the Indian Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change and has been awarded the Padma Shri. In 2005, the Center for Science and Environment was awarded the prestigious Stockholm Water Prize under her leadership. In 2016, Time magazine listed her as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. She received the Order of the Polar Star Award from the Swedish government in 2017 and the Edinburgh Medal from the City of Edinburgh Council in 2020. The medal citation recognizes Narayan's strong leadership in championing climate justice for the poor and disenfranchised. We are delighted to have you here today. Over to you, Sunita.
Thank you, Shobha. Thank you so much. And thank you for asking me to be with all of you today and to speak on what I think is a really critical issue. And climate change, as all of us know, is today an existential issue. I mean, I don't think we need to get into the what of climate change and the why of climate change. We have come a long way. I mean, when I started working in the area of climate change, it was in 1990, 1991, when climate change negotiations were just about happening. And when we went to Rio in 1992, and the Framework Convention on Climate Change was being discussed, there was still an issue of it could happen, and it would happen perhaps in our future. And all models were showing that climate change would lead to devastating impacts in our world. But quite frankly, it was way in the future. And when I speak to you tonight, we've come a long way. We've come a long way in the journey of science, where science has told us more than, with even more certainty, that we are looking at a catastrophe. But more than that, when I speak to you tonight, we see the impacts in our world. We don't need to be told about the science of climate change. We don't need to be told that there could be something that will happen in the future. In my country, India, we are already badly hit because of the impacts of climate change. We know that. We can see increased intensification of tropical cyclones. We can see extreme rainfall events happening today. You know, in India, we say that our true finance minister is really our monsoon. And today we are in a situation where we are seeing more variable and more extreme rain. Now, India, in any case, gets rain in a very short rainy period. What we are seeing now is that we are getting more rain in fewer number of rainy days, which means that we have floods and we have droughts. Now, think of the impact on the farmers of our country. Think of the impact on the farmers when they stare at crop losses because of extreme heat or extreme cold events. They are the victims of climate change. They have not contributed to the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Yet they are today the victims. They are the ones who are worst impacted. So I often say this to my colleagues in the North, in the West, that please don't preach to us about climate change. We are suffering. We know the pain of climate change. So we know that it is here. But if you think about it, when I was at Rio in 1991, 1992, when the Framework Convention on Climate Change was being discussed, it was understood very clearly that climate change is an extremely difficult issue because the gases that create climate change, the emissions, the GHG emissions, are related to what we know as growth. They are linked deeply to the way we use our energy then and even now. They are linked also to the fact that this is that as countries grow economically, they will require more energy and therefore have more emissions. So in 1992, when the Framework Convention was being discussed, it was well understood that climate change is not just about the emissions or mitigating emissions, but sharing the growth between nations. It was also understood that countries like India would need economic space, would need ecological space to be able to grow. This is why the convention in 1992 talked about common but differentiated responsibility. But what it really meant was that if we accept climate change, then the rich will have to reduce so the poor can get the right to grow. But so that the poor countries like India grow differently, they would get funds, they would get technology so that they could grow differently. Now, this is where the world has completely let us down. In the last 30 odd years since these discussions have taken place and countless negotiations have happened, let's be very clear. The developed world has singularly failed in its responsibility to drastically cut emissions or to provide the funds or the technology that is required for the emerging world to be able to grow differently. Today, the most inconvenient truth of climate change is not that we have an existential threat in front of us. But the most inconvenient truth is the fact that vast numbers of people in the world, by 2030, when the world has run out of the budget to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade, will still not have the right to development, will still not have the right to be able to grow. Now, this is really where a country like India stands today. Now, this is where we need in India a dual strategy, and we do have one. One, we need to be able to keep pressurizing the developed world, including the world where many of you live, that they must walk the talk. We cannot talk about climate change and just talk about what India must do. I see on the chat that somebody has, I think, told me that I should talk about women and children, and I will. But I want to say that the question on climate change has to be understood from the point of view of how the entire world is going to meet its responsibility. Now, within that, what does a country like India do? And what must a country like India do? The fact is, we have a huge challenge in India. We have an environmental challenge in India. We have a development challenge in India. We have to find the way in which we can derive co-benefits, benefits in which we can reduce our emissions, but also find ways in which we can mitigate our pollution and be able to grow. So this is really where we need to find answers for a country. I'm sorry, I'm not blaming the West. I am not blaming any of you who live in these countries. I am just speaking very clearly what is the reality of climate change. It's a very inconvenient truth. It is not something we like to hear. And every time I say it, I know I get accused of saying, stop finger pointing. I'm not finger pointing. I live in India. I work in India. We push for things in India, and we will continue to push for change in India. And India will continue to do things which are good for its environment, which are good for its energy. Our Prime Minister in Glasgow has said that we will walk the extra mile. We will make sure that we can get 50% of our energy requirements from renewables by 2030. Very bold statement, difficult to achieve, but I think this is where an environmentalist like me working in India is arguing that we can do it because we can find the co-benefits. Today, we have a local air pollution problem. We have to deal with deadly toxic air pollution in our cities. We know that is coming because of burning of coal. So if we can find an advantage of reducing the use of coal, reducing local pollution, and then as well make the switch to cleaner energy sources, that will also mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that's the strategy a country like India can and must take on. But it has limitations because it is also very clear that the scale of the transformation we need in the world, the transition, the energy transition we need in the world will require very bold steps. And those bold steps must come from every part of the world. If I look at what's happening today, if you look at what's happening post this horrific, horrible war that is happening in our world today, we are seeing today a greater interest in fossil fuel. We are seeing the need for energy security being discussed in the world, and therefore a greater use for LNG. We need to find strategies in which a country like India, which has such a huge challenge of providing affordable energy to vast numbers of its people, that we can do this, but we can also make sure that that energy is clean energy. Now, to do that, there will be a cost. And let's be absolutely clear about it, that a country like India can do as much as it can with its own resources. But this is where the issue of climate justice, climate equity has to step in, because we have to be able to argue that a country like India, countries like India, the continent of Africa is going to require a framework in which the global community cooperates, so that not only can a country like India, which has options to move differently, do so, but the rich countries are also pushed to be able to make the transformation that is required. So yes, there are solutions. Yes, we need to do much more. We can do much more. And I do think that the energy policy that has been put into place by the Indian government, which really says that we will scale up renewable power by 2030, that we will double our energy use between now and 2030, but that the growth will come from the renewable sector, is a very, very, very big transformation, step towards transformation. Our biggest challenge is going to mean that how can you make sure that we can still have energy at affordable prices, so that the vast numbers of people who cannot afford even energy which comes out of dirty coal or others can do so. So this is really where the challenges in India are. And let's be very clear, we know the pain of climate change. We are seeing the impacts. We are seeing the impacts particularly on the poorest in India, including women and children. And this is really something that should remind us all of the dire challenge that waits us, because today the poor of India are hit, but tomorrow the rest of us will be, because climate change is really the world's biggest equalizer. So thank you. I mean, I've also got a question from Seema asking me to speak on nature-based solutions. Let me spend a minute on that before I close. As far as nature-based solutions are concerned, India has a huge opportunity to work on nature. Now, what is nature-based solutions? Essentially, the world is understanding that we need to be able to invest in our trees, invest in our land, which can absorb climate change, so that we can actually make sure that absorb greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, so that not only do we work to be able to mitigate emissions, but we also work to be able to increase the sinks, the natural sinks in our world. Now, it's a great idea. There is no doubt. As an environmentalist, who can argue that we must not plant more trees? Who can argue that we must not green our land? Who can argue that we must not build the soil fertility in our land so that we can capture the soil carbon? We can improve productivity of our lands. No question about it. But the point, and I think this is really where the world has to think very carefully, and we in India have to be extremely cautious about this, is there are two problems with this. One, that we must not focus on nature-based solutions without understanding the limitations of nature-based solutions. The science is very clear about this, that the methodologies for computing the amount of carbon dioxide that is sequestered because of trees is still being discussed and has to be resolved. So we must not believe that this is the magic bullet and we can keep planting trees and keep flying, keep doing what we do in terms of our disastrous lifestyle, and believe that nature-based solutions will somehow get rid of all our problems. The other problem is the question about where we will plant the trees and in whose lands those trees will be planted and for what. There is huge issues in nature-based solutions unless we understand that the very driver for nature-based solutions must come from the communities on whose lands we are going to plant the trees. They must benefit from it. They must make the decisions on the trees to be planted. These trees are not carbon sticks to be able to mop up the emissions of the rich, including people like me. These trees have to be seen as part of the livelihood strategy of the people who live in our forests, whose lands are degraded today. I am, as Shobha said, I'm in Rajasthan for our meeting here, and we are discussing nature-based farming. The government of India has put out a very clarion call for nature-based farming. But the big issue with nature-based farming is how can you build the soil carbon? How can you build the ability, regenerate your lands to be able to increase the productivity? But the most important question is, how do you put more money in the hands of farmers? How do you make sure that the poor in our country who are already hit because of climate change can actually make sure that they benefit from it? So these are some of the most interesting, the issues in which India is, I think, a laboratory of both action as well as thought. And I think there is a lot happening in India. A lot more needs to happen. But I think climate change is an issue which is something that binds us all. We're all in it together. And as I said, it's a great equalizer. We need to look at it as something that brings us together rather than divides us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sunita. This was an excellent opening keynote, a lot of food for thought. I think I especially liked the way in which you described India as a laboratory for action as well as thought. And I think we'll keep that at the front of our minds as we move forward with the rest of the agenda on our climate summit. So once again, on behalf of Indiaspora and all of the attendees here today, I would like to thank you for taking time. I know that you are in the middle of another event in which you are going to dinner now. So thank you for taking 20 minutes out of your very busy schedule. And we'll move on now to the next panel in our agenda. As Sanjeev talked about in the opening, we are globalizing Indiaspora in a very big way. And this next panel hits at that very directly. It is titled Global Leadership in Climate Investing, Voices from India, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States. And to kick off this panel, I'd like to invite the moderator, Avi Sahi, who is the Chief Commercialization Officer at OGCI Climate Investments LLP. This is a $1.1 billion impact fund that is focused on deploying capital into decarbonization technology companies and projects that have application in the oil and gas, transportation, buildings, and industrial sectors. Avi himself is responsible for partnering with OGCI climate investment portfolio companies and their leadership teams to drive the accelerated delivery of growth and CO2 reduction systems at scale. So Avi, thank you so much for joining us. Avi will introduce the panelists for today's event, and then I can come on at the end of the discussion to take any questions that attendees have. Once again, as Pooja said, please put your questions in the chat box, and an Indiaspora staff member throughout will be able to get to those questions and relay them to the panel. So Avi, over to you, and thank you again for taking the time.
Yes. Thank you, Aman, for the very kind introduction. Thank you, Indiaspora, for inviting me to moderate a discussion here on climate finance specifically, and to invite a very distinguished panel of speakers with very interesting backgrounds, I think, which will help us understand how they have taken leadership roles in their respective organizations to focus on climate-linked activities that matter to them, and candidly, across the organizations and countries to drive individual and common impact and transform, the progress that needs to be made from a climate opportunity set. Rather than me introduce the panelists, I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, their organizations, and highlight the climate-linked priority focus areas that they have, underscoring what matters to you and why. Shankar, would you like to start, followed by Iran and Mridula?
Okay, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all. Very honored to be here in this group. I'm V. Shankar. I'm CEO and co-founder of Gateway Partners. We are an alternative asset manager. We invest both in growth equity as well as in private credit. Geographically, we invest across Africa, Middle East, South and Southeast Asia. Sectorally, we are agnostic, but tend to invest in established companies that produce core goods and core services that is required by the vast growing urbanizing populations across these regions. Now, specific to the topic on hand, as gateway partners, we have made strong commitments to climate, everything from the usual net zero commitment that everybody does, which is down the road, but by 2050. But we also laid out a journey in terms of the carbon intensity of our portfolio, the climate transition risks in our portfolio, as well as how much we invest in the green economy. We are roughly a 2 billion fund in terms of both our Fund 1, Fund 2, and our private credit fund at this point of time. We started in 2015. Now, specific to climate, we have made an investment very recently in a minerals and metal platform that is very much at the core of energy transition. These are the minerals and metals required to manufacture electric batteries, both for electric vehicles as well as large-scale grid storage. We also operate data centers in Africa, which are increasingly being powered by renewable energy. We're also looking at off-grid renewables, rooftop solar solutions as well. So we are working across the space, across the continents, and we are big believers that this is not just good for the world, but it's actually good business, because there's a business case here being built in terms of the green economy. Thank you.
Great. Nice to meet everyone. Thank you for having me. And I'm Aran Sandhouse. I'm the managing partner of a global fund called J Impact. It's part of the J Ventures group. And our goal is really, originally it was established in 2015. The goal was to connect Jewish people between Israel and the diaspora. Okay, so we fully understand the mission of connecting diaspora. I'm very glad to be with you here. I think there's a lot of work for all of us. Our fund specifically is empowered by a community of 400 leaders of venture and industry from 30 cities globally. Unfortunately, we're underrepresented in India, so maybe you can help us with that. And what I will say is that our two largest communities inside of our fund is in Silicon Valley. We have about 100 members in the Valley and close to 100 members in Israel. And the main thing, J Impact specifically, is fund number 3. We created it back in November to really harness the power of our community around the common Jewish value, which is called Tikkun Olam. What it means is that our job on this planet as human beings is to leave the world better than the way that we got it. Okay, so that's what we stand for, and that's where we're spending our time and energy. And really our mission is to solve the world's biggest challenges using the best technology. We've done up until now as a group about 45 investments in the last 4 years. On average, we do an investment a month, okay, give or take. And we believe also collectively that the community is stronger than any one individual. And we put that in practice in the way that we diligence companies and the way we support them. In one case, we have a company in one location that we invest in, and then we open up markets for them in another place. And we think that that's a model that works and is scalable. We also believe that there's a massive opportunity here in terms of climate, that we're here to create it and capture it, okay, together. So very similar to what Shankar just said, Mr. Shankar just said, we are here to make sure that we do well and we do good at the same time. And primarily we look for areas that there is scarcity that we can turn into abundance. And if we think about climate change, the other piece that we stand for is that this issue was created by greed, and greed is also going to be the solution. Okay, we're not trying to change human nature. We think that we should tap into it. And a part of this is really to transform what is a company, what's the purpose of a company. Company today is about maximizing shareholder return. Milton Friedman created that. We think that companies should be around maximizing stakeholder return. If we start to transform that, we're going to see a major shift happening everywhere. Now, in terms of impact specifically in climate tech, we're looking at 4 main pillars. Which is, we think about the way that we think about it is by the time that the fund will be done, we want to make sure that there's actual impact in the world, not theoretical, but the real one. So we're thinking about time to impact. So the first pillar is climate resilience and adaptability. Okay, as much as we don't like it, we already have a problem today. We see that everywhere. So we got to make sure there's food security, water security, dealing with land and fires. Second one is reducing production. Obviously, it's going to be more on recycling. We don't count on people in human nature, just to do it individually. We think that more has to be done. The third one is to improve on impact on existing solutions. So we will absolutely invest in oil and gas companies and things that can make those industries better. And I know that's kind of sacrilege in this area, but that's what's going to happen in the near term. And the last one is creating alternative solutions to go carbon neutral. And we know it's not going to be enough. We need to go carbon negative. So we're looking at nuclear, hydrogen, microgrid storage, everything else there. Currently, we have hundreds of companies in our pipeline that we're screening. And to date, we've made several investments. Just to highlight a couple to give you a feeling. One is a company in the area of recycling water in buildings. We know that more than half of people on the planet are moving into cities. And we have a company called Epic Cleantech that is turning a building into a Tesla. Okay, so zero emission for a building and recycling the water, which is something that is scarce and is needed. And the next step will be to take it rural. And the other companies in the agriculture space, it's around pollination of bees. A lot of us depend on bee colonies to actually create food. And these guys stabilize the pollination of bees, and there is a result, increase the yield of 20 to 30%. So those are just two examples out of what we do. And again, very honored to be here and very excited to talk about what we can do and how we can collaborate globally, because we know it's not going to be enough to just work in Israel or Silicon Valley. Okay, thank you.
Mridula?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So if you asked me this question 10 years ago, I was very happy running two companies that manufactured commodities, right? And 9 years ago, we ran out of water at home, which brought me very clearly to the fact that, I'd taken time off. And at that time, I realized, this was not an isolated incident. And it pushed me out of a bubble, which many of us exist in, and showed that all of us are climate vulnerable. I live in a part of India that is quite dry, and we get our water from a bore well, and we'd gone to 550 feet and it had run dry, right? So a journey that started then, taken me to Israel, by the way, and got me a lot of hope there, and led to two books. And the two books, the so what of the two books is India is probably one of the most vulnerable countries to the climate. And as Iran said, I think we've already appeared to have crossed several climate thresholds, right? Which means that adaptation really needs to become far more important in the climate conversation than it is today, especially in the investment conversation. What many of you may not realize is that India has a very high carbon price already, both in terms of our taxes on our petrol and in the coal cess, right? So which makes companies like mine very, very eager to control our carbon emissions, not just out of good citizenship, but we've been doing it for 20 years because it's an excellent lever of course. Our windmills are coming up close on 20 years, and we made those investments because they make good business sense. But on water, on waste, on resilience in our forests and in our agricultural supply chain, we have a long way to go. And that forms my entire investment thesis. So why am I here? Why did you get a person who runs two commodity factories here? It's because I'm an early stage climate change investor in India. And I invest almost exclusively on climate adaptation startups. And while we use the terms mitigation and adaptation as sort of non-intersecting circles in some conversations, they actually overlap quite a bit. So let me give you an example of one of the companies I've invested in. It manages waste, right? So it takes wet waste, which is food waste, like a lot of us throw away, and it makes it into biogas. So, the company is up on close to managing 100 tons of waste, and they make biogas that powers everything from restaurants to vehicles. So it is reducing emissions, but at the same time, if they hadn't managed that waste, that would be clogging up drains and adding to the flooding that we see in India, right? So what do I see my role? My role is to say that, you can make money in early stage climate resilience startups, right? And it is because a lot of the investors who are coming into this space, a lot of the angel investors, a lot of the VCs, a lot of the PEs come from a tech background. And the kind of skills and the mindset and your horizon that you need in climate investment, especially climate resilience investment, is very different. So what I hope to be in India is a patient voice, to hear the wonderful entrepreneurs who are making such a wonderful change. So I started investing 6 years ago, And 6 years ago, I would say it was a wonderful quarter if I had one climate resilient startup for pitching. Today, I've talked to 3. It's exploding. And, all the more we need a lot of these voices coming in and listening to customize the solution to the problem at hand in India, to the specific locale. One of the things I like saying is Chennai is 4 Israels put together. That gives you a size of how big India is. And we need the customization and the hand-holding that needs to happen. And I'm hoping to play my role in it. I have about 18 investments and it's growing pretty rapidly right now.
Well, how exciting to hear each of your backgrounds and stories. And interesting that there's, from my perspective, a reasonable amount of overlap in your approaches and the initiatives that you've taken. Can you, I'd invite the panel to talk about, many of you have given examples of different projects or investments that you've made in your respective organizations. What are some of the success factors that you see that actually accelerate performance in some of these initiatives? Can you talk about them? And also, what are the roadblocks that you're seeing that once resolved can really unlock performance at scale? And when you answer that question, I'd be curious to know what are the metrics for success? When you talk about the success, right, or the opportunity to break through roadblocks, what are the metrics you're looking at? And is that consistent across your respective portfolios? What's different because they're climate linked? Mridula, would you like to just lead us into that discussion?
Sure. So let me just make sure I got you right. What is going well?
Yep.
What are the roadblocks, and how do I judge my metrics for success?
Yep, that's it.
Okay, so I think an important part of it is policy. It's not a single policy, it's an ecosystem of policies that you need, right? So I went around with a checkbook saying, let me find a water startup to invest in India. We don't have that many, right? Whereas Israel is like the fountainhead. It's like a kid in a candy shop when you go there. And one of the reasons is that we don't have a meaningful water price, right? So it doesn't make sense for businesses to be built around. But unfortunately, more and more people are running out of water, as I did, right? So we are creating a water innovation ecosystem in the most unfortunate way possible when we have come to day zero, right? So policy, again, the size of India is both an advantage. It's a huge advantage. We don't need a price for a large part of India. One city, Chennai, not even the biggest city, is 4 Israels. So, if we have like clever pricing, we can really kick off an ecosystem. So that's a roadblock. The good thing is we are so vulnerable and we are so large, right? So you're already seeing tremendous, unicorns, absolutely profitable companies coming in renewable energy. You're seeing the startup ecosystem explode in electric mobility, right? So because you have favorable policy, you've got these big players going in, acting as motherships to pull the startups, towards their center of gravity. But a single policy in one city like Bangalore or Indore has spawned a wave of innovation and startups in waste and water, which is great, right? In terms of metrics for success, I sort of wear 2 hats. I'm trying to sort of seed the ecosystem because the climate tech ecosystem is really going forward. So just being there as a patient listening voice in the investment committee or the angel management group is one role I play. But eventually, what is the metric I want? I want to see my startups on the front page of the business dailies or on the cover of the magazine saying, these guys have become unicorns, right? And because only the exits will act as sort of the magnet to draw more and more entrepreneurs into this space. Somebody asked me, how am I doing on my portfolio commercially? Very good. 3 exits and doing very, very well indeed.
Wonderful. Iran?
Sure, I'm glad to go next. I think to answer your question of what's going well and what's not going well, I think I'll give you the same answer and then I'll elaborate. The main thing we look for is kind of like follow the money. okay, if you think about it. And what I mean by that is there are some industries that already have, like proper incentives in place and proper economics and proper capital flows. So when we invest in a company, we want to see that there's going to be a pathway for them to move forward. And by the way, I forgot to mention, we do early stage investing. Okay, so it's really critical for us to see that they move forward. And in the companies that we invested in, there's already like established markets, there's already capital flow, that we know where they're going to go next. And that really helps in many, many ways, okay? Not just in terms of appreciating the valuation of the companies, but also in attracting talent for the companies to scale, etc. And it's not uniform. If you take a look across climate tech, that's not across the board. And, to share with you some statistics, I think the good news is when we take a look at climate financing, the actual numbers went up probably around 50%, in the last year or two. So that's really good news. The bad news is that it's still around 8% of the total funding, okay, that is going to investing. And, just as preparation to this panel, I was looking to see how many, how much money and how many startups actually in Israel are focused on climate tech. Right now, it's about 560 out of 7,000. If you do the math, that's actually 8%. Okay, so, entrepreneurs are going to go where the money is. Israel in general, and by the way, I think it's true for other countries as well, is people respond to risk, to what they perceive as risk. For me, I live in California. There were like huge fires outside for the last 2 years. The sky turned orange, a couple of summers ago, and everyone understands it's now a problem. Before that, they didn't really take it that seriously. Okay, it was only like a fringe on the VC world. And it's the same in Israel. I think you have some people going to solve the problem and spending time on it. Most people, to be honest with you, are not. I mean, they're spending time on cryptocurrency and cybersecurity. They're going where they think that they're going to be able to be more successful. So, today we see, I would say, the first kind of set of companies that are there because they're value driven, they're mission driven. But what we really want to see is we want to see more capital flow going in that area. And I think that there is an opportunity for international collaboration. If people will know that they're going to start the effort and they're going to be able to scale a unicorn, it's not going to be a conversation. And the second point I want to make is I want to make a difference between companies that are software and hardware based. Okay, huge difference. Most VCs, by the way, ourselves included, like to invest in cloud and software. Companies can sell quicker. Unfortunately, climate change, most of it has to do with the physical environment, okay, with actual, with doing stuff, moving things, burning things, whatever that is. So there's to be a certain level of patience involved in that. And I think there's to be a different generation of VCs that are willing to take that kind of risk. So on our end, we're looking also for government incentives to offset that risk. And that's very attractive to us. A lot of the startups that have done well on our side have received funding, from Horizon 2020 in Europe or US funding, and again, hopefully also from India in the future.
Yeah, that's great.
Just to add, first of all, I agree with what has been said by both Mridula and Aaron. Just to add to it, what do we need? I mean, this is both a challenge and an opportunity. Having the right policy infrastructure, having the right set of incentives, and having the right set of institutions, I think it's very important. So I'll put it as the 3 I's: the infrastructure, the incentives, and the institutions that are required to move the agenda along. Now, when we look at the success factors on top of that, it has to be also about achieving scale. This is not about little drops make a large ocean. You'll have to crowd in, lean in, and focus and bet on a few technologies, which will then get the scale and the benefit. And you're already seeing that with solar. With more adoption of solar, the prices have dropped to get you grid parity. There is also a point here, Avi, about generally, understanding around these issues being joined up, and I'll illuminate that with an example. We have invested in the minerals and mining platform, Vision Blue Resources, which is actually headed by Mick Davis, who was the founder, creator of Xstrata, which is probably one of the most well-known success stories in mining. Now, if you believe that even 20 to 25% of vehicles sold globally 10 years from now are going to be electric vehicles, just 25%. And if you believe that 30 to 35% of electricity generated is going to be renewables, you would need, just a simple math of it, you would need something like 6 million tons of graphite. Last year, globally, we mined 1 million tons of graphite. You can go on, whether it's graphite or vanadium or nickel or tin, the same story applies. But people are prepared to invest in electric vehicles. They're prepared to invest in lots of stuff which they will consider as good, but they will not invest in mining. Without the minerals and metals, this revolution ain't going to take place, whether it's lithium ion or vanadium redox or whatever batteries you have. So I think there needs to be also a holistic, joined up thinking around the subject, which is probably needed. And if you talk about the metrics, our metric is frankly going to be, have we made a difference when all is done and dusted? Have the companies we have invested in made a difference to the world? And the proof of the pudding is going to be coming later.
That makes sense. And on topic of metrics, I would add that our organization, OGCI Climate Investments, we invest in opportunities that certainly span oil and gas, buildings, technology, and infrastructure. Yet our investments, we look at the impact those investment opportunities are able to deliver every year on the glide path to a 2020 target in terms of CO2 abated, as well as concurrently look at metrics around financial returns, as many investment funds have. And so that's a requirement for us to actually enter an investment, and staying true to having that balanced view, right? It causes us to focus and candidly prioritize investment opportunities that can, in delivering near-term return, concurrently deliver technological proofs around emerging solutions that then can be adopted more broadly right across different industries. Now, on the topic of industries, allow me to ask, what do you think the importance is of partnerships, right? Whether it's in the private sector, within industries, or with other stakeholders, institutions across industries working together, or possibly also with multilateral organizations. What is the importance of partnerships to unlock value and to drive speed into addressing climate change from your experience?
I think
maybe
it's absolutely needed.
Sorry, Shankar, maybe we'll ask the panels to do this just in a quick way, and then we'd like to take one audience question before we move on. So just to pause till we can get an audience question. So please, Shankar, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I think partnerships are required across private sector, bilateral donors, multilateral agencies, national governments, because that's the only way you can get scale, you can accelerate, and you can innovate. And this equation is not just about the E, but also about the S. We need to be able to make that tough choices, even as Erin mentioned, because, for instance, we've invested in the cement. The question is, without cement, there's not going to be progress on the S factor. But on the E, we are aware that cement could be the third largest polluter, but then how do you make the cement greener? That's really the issue.
Okay, so I'd like to add that in general that we think that partnerships are critical. Okay, it's not a question of if, they're absolutely critical. And just to share with you a very quick framework, we think that innovation is built in Israel or built in Silicon Valley, but that's not where the market is. Okay, so for that to happen, there's to be partnership, with India, for example, of how we scale the technology in those places, and that's what we'd like to see. And we also think, by the way, that UAE can play a big role in terms of desert technologies and testing things out in terms of resilience and scaling things over to Asia. So it's absolutely critical, and we actually want to see that in the companies that we invest in and we work with.
I'll go. I think because, especially in the resilience space, you're working with some of the most marginalized communities in the world. So some of the best startups that I've seen are actually working shoulder to shoulder with an NGO or a philanthropy. I'll give you an example of an investment I just made. Punjab has been a lot in the news because, they tend to be profligate with their groundwater to grow rice in an area that's close to a desert, right? But the startup that I've invested in helps Punjabi farmers save water. And they do it by working with a NGO who stands shoulder to shoulder with the farmer, persuading, convincing, and saying, look, you can do this and you can still be whole. And I think that partnership is very important. The second partnership is actually partnership with the policymaker, right? We think of policy and then business as a linear function, whereas in the best ones are actually continuing circles. There was this one wonderful program that I was in where you had municipal commissioners across Indian cities working, in a panel with startups. It was like children in a candy shop, because these municipal commissioners were saying, I have this problem, I have this problem, I have this problem. And the startups were saying, we have this, this. And they were just sitting together and solutioning as we spoke. It was one of the most exciting things that I've seen, right? Just back and forth. The third thing the kind of partnership that I'm going to talk is actually something I think Israel does very well. We do it very well in the textile industry, wherein big companies really provide incubation space, advice, and act as a very positive reference customers for startups. In the textile industry, up and down, we'll at any given time, we'll have we'll call them startups, trying out their products in our factory. And if they come, and we'll keep giving them suggestions on how to innovate, etc. And when they're ready to go out, if we put our brand next to them and say, look, they're doing a great job, why don't you tell our friends, like, why don't you go invest in them? And that really helps us become very, very innovative. This partnership is at a very nascent level in India in climate resilience or climate change, climate tech, and it can really make a world of difference if it comes through.
Avi, maybe we could combine two of the audience questions. So I see one here by Mihir, which asks the panelists if they use social return of investment. And then I think we can link that with an earlier question by Sahar, which is about, from the startup perspective, how they can maybe explain impact to investors, the type of impact specifically that can't be articulated maybe in an Excel spreadsheet. Maybe those two questions: how do you use social return of investment, investment as a part of your matrix, and then how startups can maybe explain that impact to you? Maybe we can link those two audience questions from Sahar and Mihir.
I'm glad to go. Okay. All right. So first of all, just to be clear, we don't use today's social return on investment. We're familiar with it. We do look for what's the latest and greatest kind of methodology, okay, in impact investing. Today, we use one methodology, which is we do a plan with every company to see what will the actual impact be, normalized to CO2 equivalent. By the way, what I failed to mention earlier, in terms of the metric, we want to see that companies have the path to impact 1% of GHG emissions within 10 years. It's a very high bar. Okay, not all of them will make it, but that's at least where we want to see it as an aspiration. And when we take a look at that, to answer the question how it actually impacts companies, we're in constant dialogue with startups. And again, to give you the perspective, there's 560 amazing companies, okay, in the ecosystem of Israel under multiple organizations like Planet Tech and Desert Tech that are focused on increasing resilience and dealing with climate change. And when we start to talk about the metrics that we measure together with those companies start to adapt as well, and we start to see it in their dialogue. So when what we ask for, we want to see that they touch at least one of the UN SDGs. We want to see that there's proper management behind proper management of metrics. We want to see the intention of the entrepreneurs, and we want to see measures that lead them there. And as we start to have this dialogue, we see companies starting to incorporate it into the decks. We also couple them with experts, okay, that can help them to really turn the numbers into something that is real and grounded in reality. So those are the kind of things that happen, and we see it as a two-way street. They're interested in the capital, and we're interested to see companies that are interested in this type of capital. And we also partner, by the way, with funds that act and work in the same way around impact, because we want to see more of those voices inside of the, the management and the cap table of the different boards.
Javier, Mridula, if you have anything, otherwise I think we are out of time. So I just want to invite you to make any last comments. So Mridula, I see your hand is up.
I'll go very quickly. I'm going to call out the danger of greenwashing in social impact. It can be very nebulous and therefore an open opportunity for a lot of people to greenwash. And I think it's critical because this is a powerful tool that we need to work. So greenwashing just erodes the credibility of everyone. What I personally look for is the number of jobs created, because that can't be fudged too much. Second is I look for alignment in the business model on the problem they're trying to solve and their connection to the revenue. in which case, once I'm clear that the alignment between the revenue model and the impact that you're solving to do is there, I just track revenue.
Thank you, Mridula. Shankar, any last words? Otherwise, we can close.
No,
Yeah.
nothing more to add. I completely believe we have to measure jobs. We have to measure the environment. We got lots of metrics. This is an evolving journey. Nobody has got the perfect answer.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shankar, Eran, Mridula. And I'd like to thank Avi for ably moderating this panel. He's an Indiaspora member, so we're so thankful to have representation from our membership leading and shepherding this panel highlighting global voices. Thank you for each of you for taking time across multiple time zones. I believe 4 time zones represented here, 4 very distinct countries approaches, but what an honor to have all 4 of you speak here today at our summit. So thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We will now move to a quick talk from our very good friend of Indiaspora, Mr. George Jacob, who is the president and CEO of the Bay Ecotarium. It's the largest nonprofit conservation group in San Francisco, overseeing 7 institutions, which includes the Aquarium of the Bay and the Bay Institute. The topic that he's going to talk about today is very interesting. He's written a book about it that came out in the pandemic called Museum Futures, the Corona Conundrum. And that's exactly, I think, the topic that he will get to today, which is climate museums moving from awareness to action. So George, thank you for joining us, and over to you, please. George, I think you're on mute, so maybe we can ask you to unmute, and you can, there we go.
Now?
Thank you. Yep, we can hear you loud and clear. Yep, thank you very much.
Well, good morning or good evening to everyone. As mentioned, we are celebrating our 41st anniversary this year as the largest nonprofit conservation group in the San Francisco Bay Area. Our front-facing offices include the Aquarium of the Bay and the Sea Lion Center, and the Bay model that we operate for the United States Army Corps of Engineers. We entertain about 1 million guests every year. And in the last several decades, we have served more than 20 million children, across the board from many parts of the world. In most of the climate conversations, we've noticed that the single common denominator that impacts most of the audiences is awareness. Climate conferences are usually attended by people who are already evangelized. But the spoils of that conversation doesn't really trickle down to the general public. And when we decided to redesign the Aquarium of the Bay, we decided to gut it and redo it as a climate and ocean conservation living center. And there are some slides that gives you a sense of scale of what we are planning here in San Francisco. Perhaps we can do the next slide. And so that kind of gives you a glimpse of some of our activities, education activities. We continue to provide 70,000 children free education every year. Next slide. And we're committed to the UN SDG goals of 30 by 30 by 2030, specifically focused on protecting our oceans. Next. So these are the 3 climate museum projects and oceanarium projects that we're currently leading. Our San Francisco project is an impact investment project of $260 million that transforms the aquarium into a climate center. The Norwegian project is in the city of Bergen, the ocean city of Bergen, which is about $300 million. And in Jamaica, in Montego Bay, we've been asked to design a $132 million climate and oceanarium. And next slide. So this gives you a sense of what is coming up on Pier 39 on the Embarcadero in San Francisco. And we have been in this location for the last 26 years. And it is on state land administered by the Port of San Francisco. And we are between Piers 35 and 39. And that entire acreage of 3.3 acres in between would be transformed into a green zone that sits on its own microgrid that uses fish waste. And the building has a biomimetic facade that uses microalgae to generate 1/3 of its power. It sits on Pier 39, which is the most visited tourist location in San Francisco. It gets about 15 million tourists a year from 100 different countries, and it contributes, over $1 billion to the local economy. Next. And just in the previous slide, there was a picture of Mrs. Biden there. She was there delivering the keynote at the unveiling of the vision. And this is the view of the Bay Ecotarium, as we're calling it, from Alcatraz. Now, the building is inspired, of course, by iridescent fish scales, but the entire narrative of climate change is being told using indigenous voices. Some of you may know that there are 97 different tribes that have lived in the Bay Area for the last 9,000 years, and many of their voices have been lost, and many of their indigenous practices have been lost. So the entire narrative focuses less on data and more on the emotive power of climate change, climate resilience, the price of inaction, innovation, solutions. And some of the comments that were made in the previous session are quite valid in terms of precipitating policy changes, encouraging investments, encouraging innovations, and finally bringing this awareness to action mode to share with the general public. Next slide. So these are some of the features of the Climate Center in San Francisco. It has 3.3 acres of green park. Between the two big pods, there is a smaller pod, which is an AI-driven pod that sits at 36 different airports around the world where San Francisco is sister cities with, including Bangalore, Paris, and Tokyo, and some of the other cities. It has a titanium rib biodome. The entire building is a prefab. The aquarium currently is the only seismically stable location on Pier 39. It's designed for 8.1, and it's actually an evacuation zone during seismic activity. And San Francisco, as you know, is a vulnerable city in that sense that it has seismic activity. It has other issues associated with seawall that runs underneath the Embarcadero, which has fissures and structural issues. And of course, there is a gradual sea level rise issue associated with it as well. The San Francisco Bay offers a lens into the pollution that happens in the bay. So we currently hold 1 million gallons of salt water that we pull from the ocean. And we hold about 24,000 animals, 230 species in our tanks. And when we do blood work and when we do microscopy, we discover copious amounts of microplastics, domic acid, mercury in some of the marine biodiversity that we see in San Francisco Bay. And there is a constant pouring of diesel that comes in with container ships every single day. So the bay is polluted, and the currents actually push the water consistently back into the bay, which is almost like a cauldron. And the pollution stays there a long time before it gets washed out and dissipated in the Pacific Ocean. And some of the reactions of the tsunami, for example, when the last volcano exploded in, I believe, a few months ago, and nothing happened for about 8 or 10 days. And then all of a sudden, the pH level in our tanks started changing because there was a wash of salt water coming into the bay. And so we are highly vulnerable and sensitive to changes, even when the snow melts on Lake Tahoe and we have an infusion of fresh water in the bay that impacts our marine biodiversity in our tanks. Next slide. And this sort of gives you the economic impact. There is a $2 billion economic impact on the Embarcadero in San Francisco in general, generates 1,000 direct and indirect jobs. It transforms San Francisco into a global destination of sorts, and it provides free education, including a virtual footprint of 250,000 kids with an annual, extended footprint of a very large visitation. Next. And those are some of the sectors that it touches. Many of you are familiar with many of these sectors. And connecting the dots, that becomes important as, one of the people pointed out in the previous session that, understanding mining and connecting it with batteries is as critical as connecting the dots that impact climate change as a phenomenon. Next. Next slide. So during the pandemic, we visited the Prime Minister of Jamaica, and he had Holness, and he had asked us to create a climatorium in Jamaica, and that's a master plan that we're presenting to Prime Minister Holness. Next slide. And this gives you a sense of the $132 million project in Jamaica. It's designed, inspired by the elkhorn corals. The cup shapes minimize the footprint on the beach, and is diametrically across from the ferry terminal in Bergen, which also experiences a significant tourist footfall. And the waterfall that you see is about 20 meters, just to give you a sense of the scale. And the three shells, one shell holds the life support system. This facility will hold 30,000 animals and about 2.2 billion gallons of salt water. And there's a mangrove that you can see on the education shell on the foreground on the right side. Next. That's a nighttime view. It's a diminished lumen level and gives you a sense of the spectacular project. Next. And this gives you some clean features associated with this new facility. Next. Impact. Again, there is an impact on education, tourism, economy, and it has a revenue model that projects 33 million revenue inflow in year 1, year 2, and year 3. Next. This image is, how sperm whales sleep. So this is a sleeping pod of sperm whales. They sleep like coffins. They can hold their breath for 28 minutes. These animals are about 16 meters in length, and they're also the loudest animals on the planet. An F-35 takes off at 135 decibels, 160 decibels. A sperm whale clicks at 230 decibels. So if you're anywhere close to it, it can tear your internal organs and paralyze you. And their clicks can be heard thousands of miles away. So this is sort of the inspiration for the Norwegian aquarium that we are designing. And the next slide will give you a sense of the scale of just the lobby of this aquarium. Next. So once you're in this immersive environment, this is a 4 million gallon tank that holds Norwegian biodiversity. And the story of climate change is projected on melting icebergs in the subsequent galleries of this facility. Next. We'll go past the slide. Next, please.
This is our last slide.
Oh, okay. So this was a National Geographic book that came out from Italy, and it talks about many solution providers, and somehow ended up in this mix. So happy to take any questions.
George, thank you very much for sharing that fantastic project. It was a pleasure to see the pictures, and can't wait to see it in person. The thoughtful and inclusive design project in terms of how it's powered, who you've considered and what you've built. It's really inspiring. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
And we will now move on to our next fireside chat. It's on theory to practice, academia's role in the fight against the climate crisis. It's a pleasure to introduce our two esteemed academics joining us today, Dr. Anu Ramaswamy and Dr. Veerabhadran Ramanathan. Dr. Anu Ramaswamy is an interdisciplinary environmental engineer and professor at Princeton University with appointments across civil and environmental engineering, the High Meadows Environmental Institute, and India Studies. She has pioneered sustainable urban system science and knowledge co-production for developing low carbon, healthy, and equitable cities. Her research explores how key sectors shape human and environmental well-being from local to global scales. Ramaswamy works with cities on accounting for their carbon emissions and designing pathways to get to net zero emissions by 2050. She is working with communities to evaluate equity in design implemented at the city scale also. She is the author of more than 100 peer-reviewed articles published in leading journals. She is the inaugural director of the MS Chadha Center for Global India at Princeton University, the lead principal investigator and director of the NSF-supported Sustainable Healthy Cities Network, and serves on the UN Environment Program's International Resource Panel. And now to introduce Dr. Veerabhadran Ramanathan. Professor Ramanathan is the Freeman Endowment Presidential Chair Emeritus for Climate Sustainability at the University of California at San Diego and Cornell Climate Solutions at Cornell University. He discovered the greenhouse effect of chlorofluorocarbons and other heat-trapping pollutant gases. His findings on non-CO2 global warming pollutants has led to several successful climate mitigation actions worldwide, including the formation of Climate and Clean Air Coalition by the United Nations to mitigate short-lived climate pollutants. He is the recipient of the prestigious 2021 Blue Planet Prize and the 2018 Tang Prize. He was listed as Foreign Policy Magazine's Top 100 Global Thinkers of 2014 and named 2013 Champion of the Earth Laureate for the Science and Innovation category by the UN Environment Program. He served as a science advisor for Pope Francis' Holy See delegation to the Paris Climate Summit in 2015. He leads University of California's Bending the Curve Climate Solutions Education Protocol taught at many campuses around the world. He is elected to the Pontifical Academy of Science as a council member, Royal Swedish Academy of Science, the US National Academy of Science, and the World Academy of Sciences. It's an honor and a pleasure to have both of you here, and we look forward to hearing what you have to share.
Shobha, do you want me to go first or Dr. Ramaswamy?
Dr. Ramanathan, please start
Yeah.
first. It'll be a pleasure to have you share. Yeah.
Okay, I was just delighted to hear how much engaged is this group in climate change. The first thing I want to mention to you is that climate change is not something which is going to happen tomorrow or 10 years from now. It's already happening. It's in a crisis stage. Just to mention my home state, California, we have lost 40% of our forests to fires, and primarily because of the warming that's happening. And very few still understand the urgency of the problem we are facing. And our administration, US and worldwide, we are talking about preventing the 1.5 degree warming happening. The planet is already heated by 1 degree. And 1 degree may not seem much to many of you, but we have seen in the last 10 years the tremendous amount of storms, droughts, fires, heat waves that has already triggered. What I had gone on the record predicting, now the United Nations agrees with me, we are going to cross the next major threshold of 1.5 degree warming in about 8 years from now. So what that means is that as we recover from the COVID and now the Ukraine war, I'm assuming all of this will take about 5 to 6 years to sort it out. Our COVID moment for climate change will come on us. So going from 1.5 degree to from 1 to 1.5, that's a 50% amplification of the warming. And I'm fully expecting all of you here and your uncles, your aunts, your children, your grandchildren will all experience climate change directly. Okay, so let me just focus on one issue, and then I'm more keen to hear what Professor Ramaswamy is going to tell us. It's a huge environmental justice issue of unimaginable proportions. About 50% of the pollutant emissions comes from the wealthiest 1 billion. I'm assuming all of us in here. And about 85% of the emissions, 85 to 90, comes from the wealthiest 1 billion and the middle income, those who live in cities, etc. The poorest 3 billion, 40% of the population, have almost nothing to do with this. Their total emission is about 5%. And this 3 billion, we have left them behind just with primitive energy sources. They're still burning firewood, dung, etc., just to survive. And they're all rural farmers. And the worst consequences of climate change is already upon them, but it's going to get a lot worse, like I said, in about 8 years from now. In terms of droughts, in India, when it pours, it's going to pour like hell. It's already happening. So the floods and the heavy rain would leach out the soil. And then the rest of the season, it's going to be dry, hot season. So what we need to think about when we're thinking about developing nations, South Asia, Latin America, South America, Africa particularly, is that we've got to give them energy access to cope with the disasters. When we have heat waves, what are we going to do? We're going to put air conditioning in our homes, but they have no energy. And just to get water in places like Maharashtra, women walk about 2-3 miles with their daughters. So that's what we need to think about. the wealthy of us have to cut down our emissions by at least a factor of 2 to 3 in the next 10 years. But at the same time, we need to give energy access so that they can deal and cope with the climate change we have unleashed on them. They had nothing to do with this. Thank you.
Thank you for laying out in such detail the issue of justice and the imminent threats that are already upon us. I thought I would focus my remarks on both the challenge and the opportunity offered by cities and urbanization. And I'll talk a bit about the US, but also about India, because the Center for Global India that I lead at Princeton is of course interested in urbanization in India, China, and the US, broadly speaking. So the first thing I wanted to say is that the question of inequality and equity is really front and center. And you see it when you talk about rural areas, particularly rural areas surrounding urban areas. And so when you think of urban areas as being part of the solution, the first thing they have to consider is how do urban areas grow without really exacerbating the risks that rural communities are already facing. And if we could get cities, particularly in India, in Africa, that are going to grow, 400 million more people are going to be coming into cities in India. The first primary thing is, can we have more compact development, which is easier said than done, more managed growth, and have policies that prevent even more inequities with the rural surrounding areas. So we don't want to lose farmland, we don't want to have impervious development, and we want to try to grow compact. So we do have some solutions. In fact, just last week, we hosted Bimal Patel, who is one of the architects in India, who has been engaged in Ahmedabad, planning and design in Ahmedabad. And so this question of how do we get even just reasonable urban planning becomes really important, so that it's more compact, and that compactness can give us in many ways, if it's well designed, the well-being with lower resource use. Because right now we're just having very high well-being with very high resource use. So less motorized travel, more walkable streets, more tree canopy, we talked about nature-based solutions, and less air pollution. And so all of those things are foundational on better land use planning and preserving our rural, food baskets. The second thing I wanted to say was we just have to tackle inequality. We have all these things, smart city missions, and I always feel you don't need that much data to know where you need to focus, on good housing, climate adaptive housing, sanitation, water supply. All the talks previously emphasize this for the most underserved in both countries, in all countries. The third is actually one that our research group is very interested in, is thinking about circularity and resource circularity opportunities. And some of them are around what we're calling regenerative farming, which has a lot of potential, a lot of unknown science as well around carbon sequestration in forests, in urban forests. But those are the solutions that lie at the intersection of inequality, equity, climate adaptation, and getting to quote unquote net zero. And then the last is we definitely need innovations, like we talked about in the previous panel, electric mobility, waste to energy. And so the question finally for urban areas is, how do you bring all these very disparate strategies into a common framework? And so in my work, I've been really fortunate to work with cities, both in India and in the US, but across multiple levels of government, because it's too slow to work with one city at a time. So more and more we're working with metropolitan organizations that have 100, 200 cities beneath them, doing this multi-level planning to even think about coordination, because the lack of coordination is one of the largest challenges to get to both adaptation and climate emission mitigation. So I'll just stop saying that there are challenges, but that cities can be part of the solution, but it needs all of these pieces to come together. Thanks.
Thank you both very much for that. It was nice to hear about your focus areas. And I see from the comment section that there is somebody who has raised a point about, I'm trying to see quickly whether there is a question here, has done groundbreaking work on centering equity with urban growth, clean energy manufacturing and smallholder. And Ram Gada has a question, are people with many means of consumptions ready to sacrifice their standard of living to consume less to reduce a carbon footprint? I don't know whether that's a rhetorical question or a question. I mean, it's hard to know. Let you take the question. Dr. Ramanathan, it's addressed to you.
Oh, yeah. Based on my experience, I give a lot of public talks. I primarily work with faith groups because I think they have the forum to communicate this directly to the public. See, the fundamental issue we face is that America is probably the country which is polluted the most as far as climate change is concerned. And America holds a lot of the brain trust. But unfortunately, we in the US, we are divided no matter what the issue is. And climate change got into all the other political, cultural, racial issues that divide us. So the issue we face, I personally, I'm working on this, but I'm quite frustrated, is that we have to unpack climate change from all the issues which divide us. And education, and the one we heard from Mr. Jacob on the aquariums, they are the way to go. I think we need to have unbiased education, not getting worried about who is a conservative, who is a Democrat. We are all Americans. If we can communicate it using faith institutes, churches, temples, synagogues, and aquariums, I think Americans will come forward. They're one of the most generous, as we all know. The problem is climate change and the suffering of all of us, but particularly the poor, have gotten lost in all the issues. Now, of course, the COVID and on the foothills, on the footsteps of COVID, we have this Ukraine war. So I'm assuming that's what is going to consume us. The challenge for those of us involved in climate change and worried about it is how do we unpack it and let our voices be heard?
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramanathan, Dr. Ramaswamy. Really appreciate you highlighting the urgency of the problems that we're facing. Our next presenter is Brimal Shah. Brimal is the co-founder of Kiva, a crowdfunding nonprofit that's raised over $1 billion in zero interest capital for entrepreneurs around the world. Brimal is now launching renewables.org, a crowdfunding site to accelerate clean energy across India and Africa. Brimal serves on the boards of change.org and the Center for Humane Technology. He has been recognized as a White House champion for change and has been selected to Fortune magazine's 40 under 40 list. Welcome, Brimal.
Thank you. Thank you, Pooja. I'm not sure if folks can see the screen. Oh, there we go. And I just have some visuals because I'm a very visual person. I wanted to introduce an attempt to really make it simple for everyday people who are part of the walking worried of climate change, thinking about what we can do as individuals, really mainly kind of in the U.S., Europe, to help decarbonize, accelerate decarbonization, and offer a new way to do that. So if we could go to the next slide, just for background, nearly 20 years ago, I started a nonprofit called Kiva.org with a few other co-founders, and the premise is simple. microfinance, which I had studied Muhammad Yunus in college, and he later won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in Bangladesh, really pioneering microfinance, the provision of loans and other financial services to the world's working poor. It was so hopeful to me. And sometimes when you think of kind of poverty, it can really, you can have compassion collapse or compassion fatigue. It just feels overwhelming. And then here comes a solution like microfinance, which, although not perfect, was really exciting because it provided, for example, women like Lily here in India access to a loan so that she could grow her tailoring business. And I started out my career at PayPal as one of the first product managers there, and was wondering if you could PayPal a microloan across wealth and geographic divides. Someone in San Francisco lending to someone, say, in Ahmedabad, India. We started this website, Kiva, and this is a screenshot of that. And it's crowdfunding for microfinance. And if you go to the next slide, the way it works is the internet community will visit the Kiva website. They'll make loans in $25 increments. And then we send that money to a local partner microfinance bank in over 80 countries who lend to entrepreneurs like Lily for her tailoring business. As she repays the loan that's collected by the local microfinance bank, sent back to Kiva, and then the Kiva's website software essentially sends repayments to the internet lenders into people's Kiva account. And so if you go to the next slide, we launched this, in 2005, and just if you hit play, this gives you a sense of just the growth in the early years. This is a data visualization where each little arrow, sorry for the music, but each little arrow here, you'll see from kind of the west coast of the United States went to East Africa. That's where we started, 7 borrowers in a village. And then all of a sudden, word started catching on, and then Muhammad Yunus won the Nobel Peace Prize, which overnight really educated kind of certainly the American market, but really the world around microfinance. And then you can see just people coming to this website because it made it simple and created feedback loops around getting involved in microfinance. And so it's you'd lend money and you'd get it back. It wasn't for profit, but it also wasn't a pure donation. It was somewhere in the middle between a donation and a 10% return investment. So it's like lending money to a friend. So one of the really interesting things is just based off of this experience. If you go to the next slide, $1.6 billion, which, in the grand scheme of how much we need for climate finance and really for efforts like microfinance is small. I get it. It's a drop in the bucket, but drops in the bucket are how we fill it. And this is all raised in, kind of $25 increments from, millions of people on the internet. So if you go to the next slide, the thing I've been really curious about, because deepest in my heart, the issue that I think many of us are here kind of watching this because we want to figure out what we can do with what we believe is the existential risk for us around climate is, I was wondering, would a Kiva for climate change work? So not just for microfinance, but really around climate change. And one of the most hopeful things, I think, for me, as I learn more about climate, is that the cost of solar has dropped by 80% over the last decade. And in 2/3 of the planet, it's now cheaper than coal. In fact, in India, for example, solar is half the cost as it is in America because the labor costs to install and maintain the asset are much lower than America. And the decarbonization impact, the grid is twice as dirty in India as it is in America. India's grid is almost 75% coal. And so the marginal impact per dollar, if you could actually accelerate the transition to clean energy in India, if we could unlock more capital, and not just from huge institutions, but just everyday people like us who care, that could be really powerful. So if you go to the next slide, we are just about to launch this website called renewables.org. And it's, it tries to make it simple to invest in, rooftop solar across East Africa, in India. And the value proposition, if you go to the next slide, is hopefully pretty simple. We believe we can offer retail investors, starting with accredited investors now, and then eventually by the end of this year, we want to open it up to non-accredited investors. That's just truly anyone who has a little bit of money to invest. A 6 to 8% return. The catch is that it's a longer term loan because it maps to the repayment streams of solar. And we estimate that about $1,000 invested would be equivalent to the average American's CO2 emissions per year. So as you think about the things that we can do individually, once we are, I said, more climate aware, I think to work that George does, and others, it's certainly obviously, eating less meat and, looking at electric vehicles and kind of, there's many ways that we can reduce our footprint, but I think our investment portfolio has a role to play. And if you think about it, what gets me excited is this is generally uncorrelated with the S&P 500, or where people generally have a lot of their investment portfolio. It's the sun in markets like India and Africa, and our ability to manage these assets. So there are many solutions, many top-down solutions needed for sure. This is just one bottoms-up solution that we're hoping to bring to the market and make it as simple as possible for people to move from awareness to action around this issue.
Thank you, Premal. That was such a good visual to see. I did appreciate your putting it together as a visual as a layperson who got to understand it. It was great to see that the walking worried can contribute to solutions by using the Kiva model to participate in seeking climate solutions. So thank you. We are excited to see where it goes, and thank you for sharing your message here today. Next up, we have our panel on bringing stakeholders along, collaborations in the climate sector. This panel is going to have Raashina Humayun, our Indiaspora member, as a moderator and speaker. Raashina serves as an environmental commissioner for the city of Los Altos, California, where she works with local government and city management to form the environmental policy, as well as develop and implement the climate action and adaptation plan for the city. Raashina is also Chief Strategy Officer and Creative at Large for Enact Arts, a non-profit organization that uses the evocative lens of theater and the creative power of storytelling to bring the South Asian perspective to a global audience. Additionally, she serves on the board of the 1947 Partition Archive and the India Community Center. Raashina is an IIT Delhi alumnus and has degrees in environmental engineering and chemical engineering from the University of Massachusetts and the Ohio State University. Raashina worked at Lam Research Corporation for nearly 20 years and holds more than 60 patents, and has led path-breaking technical advances in the semiconductor industry that are embedded in most devices we use today. In addition to supporting several social and environmental causes, she is passionate about innovation, strategy, and leadership, as well as gardening. Raashina, thanks so much for being with us here today, and we are excited to hear from you and your fellow panelists.
Thank you so much, Shobha. It's an honor to be here and share the stage with scholars like Vaishali and Karthikeya. I come at this from very small, very local scale, and these folks, transcend the national and the international, truly go global. Dr. Karthikeya Singh is Program Director at the SCD Fund with more than a decade of experience engaging with government, research institutions, intergovernmental organizations, civil society, and private companies in the sustainable development sector. He's traveled from the Arctic to the Antarctic, exploring the challenges of energy geopolitics in the changing climate. He comes to SCD from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he led the center's Engaging Indian States initiative to develop new strategies and creating new networks to bolster public and private sector engagement with Indian states. Karthikeya holds a BS in ecology and sustainable development, a master's from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and a PhD from the Fletcher School of Environmental Policy. Really, an experience that comes, very, very deep and then very, very broad. I'm so excited to have you here, Karthikeya. And then I invite Vaishali Sinha, Very, very short in bio because, her experience, both of these guys is so vast. And Vaishali is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Renew Power, one of India's largest renewable energy IPPs and the first Indian renewable energy fund to list on NASDAQ. Under the ambit of Renew India initiative, Vaishali drives the company's corporate social responsibility and sustainability initiatives, and is also founding chair of Renew Foundation, the company's philanthropic arm. Vaishali is a master of integrating corporate sustainability, ESG, and responsible investing within business strategy. Through several leadership roles at Renew, Vaishali strategically advances causes such as gender equality, climate change, climate action, energy equality, and so many more. Prior to Renew, Vaishali had worked as an investment banker for over 50 years in the US, UK, and India. Vaishali is a master's degree in public policy from Columbia University School of International Public Affairs, where she was the American Association's University of Women Scholar. Thank you so much for being here, Vaishali and particular. Look forward to this discussion. Again, as I said, I come at this from a very, very local stage. You guys are, so much broader and have worked across so many, so many layers of collaborations, partnerships. But first, before we go into all of that, maybe if you could tell us just, a 1-minute intro of how both of you got involved, you developed a passion for climate action and this, environmentally sustainable policy and industry. So maybe we could start.
Sorry, I can't hear Raashina. I can't hear you clearly. Did you ask me to start first or Karthikeya?
You could go first. So you could go first. Is my volume not okay?
Yeah, I don't know if others can't, but at my end, the audio is a little bit
like you're
unclear.
Underwater.
But
okay, so why don't you go ahead and talk and I'll try and fix my audio.
Oh, okay, great. And so you wanted me to just talk about how I got into this whole area of climate change, etc.
Yeah, just very briefly, how you developed a passion for this area.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. And thank you, Raashina, for that very, very kind introduction. And I want to thank Indiaspora for this initiative, especially it's ahead of, the Earth Day, which is in a couple of days. So very well timed and, great set of speakers. So learned a lot as I waited, but I'm an accidental sort of person who landed in this area. It wasn't planned, though I did spend my high school years and college years, engaging in environment-related activities. So started young, but had a very boring career in investment banking, etc. And then, Sumant, my husband, actually started this venture, and I got involved in it just to help for some time till they built a team. And then I got sucked in. And as we speak now, I love it because I do feel we have a substantial impact, not only in at a subnational level in India, at the rural level in India, at a national level, but also globally. And I really do believe that it's an area which really is critical for all of us to get engaged. So I've never left since. So that's a quick introduction on why I'm here.
Yeah, thank you. And, quite a happy accident, Vaishali, that you did get interested in this area. I think my story is a little bit more deliberate in terms of being really wanting to be in this space. You in my bio, it mentions that I'm a trained ecologist. And, I don't know how far back to go, but growing up in Baroda in Gujarat, I was just a couple of kilometers from the Baroda Zoo. And that was where I guess I got indoctrinated, going every weekend and just being fascinated by the animals I saw there. And I think that still drives me for what I do, even though the world in which I operate is trying to make human lives and human existence more sustainable. It's really informed by the desire to create a living planet and space for the other, inhabitants of our planet. And, I've had a career that's been driven by that, both in terms of climate advocacy in India and starting a youth movement back in the day, and driving the first sort of electric car that was being manufactured in India by a company called Reva, which was then acquired by Mahindra from Chennai to Delhi. And then it's just kind of rolled on, and I've stayed in the theme of sort of climate and sustainability through my various avatars. And continue to sort of be very focused on India, but also other parts of the world, and seeing how the landscape has evolved. Sunita Narain was a mentor of mine. I have spent some time at CSE out of college, understanding what are the challenges of energy poverty and energy access in India. And now I'm kind of trying to have an impact in that landscape through the philanthropic space.
Thank you so much for that. And Shobha's telling me we only have 10 minutes. So let's maybe get to the heart of it. As I was saying, I come at it from a very local scale, the individual urban city, in a reasonable, well-off part of the US. But even so, I found a lot of challenges, bringing the different stakeholders, economic, political, social, to the table, and getting agreements on some some what seems like very simple policy changes, etc. Tell us about from your perspectives, and Vaishali, being at the national level and probably more at the global international level, as far as I can tell. What are some of the different collaborators you have to work with, and what do you have to do to bring those to the table and get them behind you to really amplify your impact? And hopefully we can do this in just a couple of minutes so we can continue on with a few more questions.
Sure. Thanks, Raashina, for that question. Just to give you a quick background, Renew Power is India's largest clean energy company. We got listed on NASDAQ recently, and we generate about 10 gigawatts of clean energy if you look at our generation and installed pipeline. And we were just recently ranked as one of the top 10 companies in the world by Fortune on their global list as a company which is having maximum impact with respect to changing the world. Now, all of this is not possible at an individual level. We have to collaborate. We set up farms in the back of beyond locations in India, and we have investors who are global. So you need to be able to explain what you're doing, how you're doing, and how you're creating value across time zones and across geographies. So, I hope I don't need to explain why we must be collaborative, and we wouldn't have been here if we weren't so. So let me take some examples of how we collaborate and who do we collaborate with. So to operate at a local level, at the grassroots level, we need to acquire land. We need to be sensitive to the flora, fauna. We are very, very sensitive to that. ESG is absolutely at the top of our priority with respect to how we do business. What we do is great, but how we do is even more important. So engaging with the local authorities is critical. So that is one collaboration. We spend a lot of time and effort to ensure that what we lay foundations for is the right way of going about things. And trust me, it sounds really easy when I say it, but to do these things with the highest standards of corporate governance and commitment and care and responsibility doesn't necessarily come in naturally and easily in the Indian ecosystem, though a lot has changed and is much better than what it was. It really is important to collaborate at the policy level, at the central government level, and people, as one of the speakers earlier was saying, Premal, I heard him say that people didn't believe in what we were doing. It wasn't a business model which was believable. People thought we were kind of not clear about what we wanted to do. Like, why would anybody buy renewable energy, which is so much more expensive, when people expect to get free bijli and pani in our country? And I'm sure for those who don't, there's free water and electricity. That is a basic right here in India. So it was a pretty difficult narrative and a model to prove on the ground. And I think we did that. We couldn't have done it without a collaborative approach with the government, with the investors who are our key stakeholders for fundraising, capital raising, and also for policy formulation. I know we have limited time, but with industry also, what we do, and after we've been successful, I would say that was 3 to 5 years down our journey in this space, it was important for us to share this with others. And so how do we convert India Inc. to be believers in this energy transition and to make them a part of it? So to go beyond yourself and think about the larger ecosystem requires purposeful collaboration. And that's what we also did, because when you do that, the pie becomes bigger and we all benefit. And you know, it's also feeding into the larger purpose. You can't do this without communities, and that is extremely important. And the communities for us, women and youth in our communities, are critical because climate change impacts them the most, and we live where it's happening. We live where people are suffering. So it is our corporate social responsibility and our sustainability agenda to address this issue, you know, kind of firsthand and with full force. So we're quite committed to that. Innovation, R&D, academia partnerships. We work with, you know, various universities in the United States for pilot projects to address on-the-site issues, and also to come up with R&D for a long-term objective. So short-term and long-term purposeful collaborations with academia is critical. And I can go on. I mean, I can't imagine doing business without collaboration, but I think the important thing is, can we have a short-term purpose? Because we are industry, we are businesses, we need a purpose to do things, but the purpose needs to be purposeful as well. In the sense, we have to go beyond our purpose. And I think that balance is critical if we want to bring around change and transformation. Over to you, Raashina.
You're muted.
I switched audio, so hopefully it's a little bit better.
Much better.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. So Karthikeya, tell us about your journey a little bit. And I know you've worked with, you know, government organizations, you work with countries, you work with, and so tell us a little bit on how you bring partners to the table. What are some of the...
Thanks. I mean, I'm very much a networks and ecosystem kind of guy, you know, in terms of creating a template and a model for collaboration and innovation to take space, to take root across transnational boundaries. And I think, you know, it's fortuitous that I'm here with, I know that there are many of my former colleagues from CSIS that are here, where, you know, we really kind of pioneered what subnational cooperation with India could look like when we were given a grant by the State Department at the sort of Modi-Obama summit of 2016. I was at the US Department of Energy at that time and didn't realize that I'd end up getting to work on this really interesting concept of trying to bring together states and cities in both countries and figuring out how they could learn from each other and really further the sort of climate and clean energy transition project and efforts in a collaborative space. And I think the first issue was kind of understanding and mapping the energy priorities of Indian states. You can't start to collaborate without understanding what are the priorities of a country like India. And I think Sunita and Narain really started us off on a good note in explaining kind of what the challenge has been in trying to talk to India about climate and tell India to act on climate without fully appreciating the local you know, context and the needs of the Indian population. And then on the basis of those priorities, where we really went around to 19 Indian states and met with officials from the power sector up and down the value chain, then trying to find the right partners, state officials, city governments, companies, research universities, to kind of forge a kind of alliance. And that's where it also became a hard sell to get US states to think about international energy collaboration, why that matters. So ending up, you know, with Colorado, with New Jersey, with New York, with California, all these states, Montana, West Virginia, who were very receptive, once socialized as to why they needed to engage with India on these issues, really allowed for us to kind of structure these really unique strategic energy dialogues between US and Indian states. And you know, that work continues on thanks to the efforts of my colleagues at CSIS, but it was a really unique pairing between various different states, and all that information is available online. I know that we're kind of limited on time, but it also fostered some unique collaborations I mentioned to you between the city of Los Angeles and the state of Maharashtra through the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, which is certainly something that I think needs to be replicated in India. A world-class clean tech incubator like that needs to exist in various Indian states, and that requires incredible collaboration from both government, national, subnational, but also companies to dock in, and academic institutions. And that's something that we're trying to now, in my current role, support in some of the geographies.
Thank you so much. There was so much more we could have learned from both of you, but I'm sure there will be another chance. I pass it over to Aman to introduce our closing speaker. Thank you, Vaishali. Thank you, Karthikeya.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Raashina. Thank you, Vaishali. Thank you, Karthikeya. I think this is one of those areas in which we have, an extreme bounty of Indian diaspora leaders in this space, and so we try and make sure we can highlight as many. But to move to an agenda in which we tackle global partnerships, global academics, global investors, I think making sure we can highlight the Indian diaspora is so great. So thank you so much for conveying your message in short time. I'd like to introduce our final closing speaker. We're very excited to have Manish Bapna, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Nrdc, join us for our closing keynote. He joined as CEO of the Nrdc in August of 2021, where he oversees over 700 attorneys, scientists, advocates, policy experts, in the fight against climate change. And he was previously also the Vice President and Managing Director of the World Resources Institute for more than 14 years. So an incredibly accomplished gentleman, a representative of the Indian diaspora working at the pinnacle of the fight against climate change for us. So thank you, Manish, for joining us, and over to you for your closing keynote, please.
Great, thank you, Aman, and what a tour de force this last 2 hours has been. So many incredible speakers with so much to say. I'm going to try to do something that I will not be able to do effectively, which is in 8 minutes, try to talk a little bit about the state of play on both mitigation and adaptation, but through an equity lens, and really wanted to bring out the issue of equity kind of more front and center. I suspect most of us on this call today that are committed on climate issues do so in no small part because of a value, a motivation around fairness, around justice, and thought it would be useful just to kind of dig deep on that in these closing minutes. On mitigation, one of the things that's happened over the past few years, and it got reinforced late last year with an intergovernmental panel on climate change report, is the importance of 1.5 degrees as the threshold for global warming. This is in no small part because if we breach that threshold, the risks of catastrophic impacts increases significantly. We start hitting tipping points that could be very difficult to recover from. Just to give one very quick example, you could imagine ice melting. As the ice melts, ocean water, which is much darker, becomes more visible, absorbs more heat, creates a vicious cycle. So this point about 1.5 degrees, the latest science has demonstrated critically important as a threshold. So where are we on the 1.5 degree fight? If you add up all the commitments that have been made over the past few years since the Paris Agreement, and that got kind of further developed in Glasgow at the climate conference in Glasgow, we're on a 2.7 degree pathway. So quite far from 1.5. And that is if all the commitments made actually get implemented. So the United States, which has taken a 50 to 52% target, is not on track to meeting that target. So in order to get to 1.5, we both need to see commitments made actually get fulfilled. We need to see real implementation. And at the same time, we need to see much greater ambition. There are many reasons we're in this place, but in no small part because rich countries aren't doing their fair share. Ram was speaking earlier about this issue. If you take India, still, despite increases in growth and reductions in poverty, less than 2 tons of carbon per capita per year. In the United States, it's still roughly 15 tons per capita per year. Part of the challenge is that the Paris Agreement represented a very different approach on how to solve global collective action problems. In the pre-Paris Agreement world, we had a rules-based approach where everyone was kind of assessed how much each country needs to reduce emissions. In the post-Paris world, everyone makes voluntary contributions. But then the challenge, of course, if everything is voluntary, does it add up? And that's where India's played an absolutely critical role in helping make sure that rich countries do their fair share. India's been a strong voice on equity in making sure not only reducing emissions, but also providing support for developing countries to do the same. So that remains one of the big equity challenges in the mitigation debate. We also see that within countries. There's been a lot of talk, absolutely rightfully so, that the costs are declining significantly. We're able to see the ramp up of clean energy. But how do we make sure that that transition that's taking place within countries, the energy transition, is done in ways that actually don't further exacerbate existing forms of inequality? Where we may create new jobs for clean power may not be where we lose jobs as industries start to transition away from fossils. So this point about how we actually can address the distributional consequences of the transition within countries becomes incredibly important. The good news, the silver lining, is that the economics of taking action on climate are so much more attractive today than they were even a few years ago. 10 years ago, people would have to choose between, do I focus on climate or do I focus on growth? Today, people recognize that's a false choice. One actually sees the two as inextricably linked. On the adaptation side, the big realization over the past few years, impacts are happening today. They're not tomorrow. They're happening here, everywhere, not somewhere else. 19 of the 20 hottest years on record have happened since the year 2000. We all know India is an especially vulnerable country, whether it's heat, drought, floods. Not going to go into the details. I was in Delhi a couple of weeks ago, March 2022, the hottest March in recorded history in India. Yet the adaptation side, the equity challenge on adaptation is people don't talk about adaptation. They don't talk about investing in resilience to the extent that it deserves. In part because building resilience is tough, right? Taking action to prevent a future harm is not an easy thing to do. Getting people, getting communities, getting countries to invest in prevention is challenging, especially when the climate risk may not be very clear, at least was the case in the past. The second reason, those that are most vulnerable to climate impacts, vulnerable communities, vulnerable countries, have the least political voice, right? So they don't have the strength, this presence, this agency in the same way that we would imagine rich countries to do so. It's a fundamental moral challenge that I think we as a community have to face. And third, it's going to take money. The good thing about adaptation or building resilience, it makes great economic sense, but not all of the benefits can be monetized. So you need finance. And that gets back to how do we actually finance investments in building resilience? And this takes public money. Private money won't always do the job because there isn't revenue to be earned. It needs public money, governments, and from the rich world to the poor world. The good opportunity that we see in front of us is COP27 in Egypt is going to be taking place in November. It'll be a major COP in Africa. Issues of resilience, issues of equity are going to be front and center. So there's an opportunity to really, really highlight these issues. Just want to close came across this quote, pessimists are right more often, optimists win more often. And I think despite the challenge we're seeing in mitigation and adaptation, there's a lot to be said about optimism. And as many of you may know, today, April 19th, in 1775, was the start of the American Revolution. 700 British troops, 77 folks in Massachusetts, Concord, Lexington, against those odds. So I remain quite optimistic, even though the challenge before us is sobering indeed. That 8 minutes, equity, mitigation, adaptation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Manish. We appreciate you being here with us today and appreciate you ending with some silver lining. I know you have a hard stop, and so we don't have time for audience questions, but really appreciated the insights that you provided today. Thank you. And now to close out our program for the evening, we have a music video that Grammy Award-winning artist and environmentalist Ricky Cage has shared with us. It's a rendition of his recent composition, Divine Tides.
चाहत है सुकून की तो मन में अमन तू रखना राहत है